This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Yesterday, a friend on social media asked me, how can a person be so zealous in the work of restoring classical Catholic education and yet be against the trad Catholic movement? And my answer to that question is that these two things have nothing to do with each other. And in this talk, I'd like to explain that with a little bit of detail. So to repeat the question, he was asking me about myself. He was asking me how I can be a person who works to restore and promote classical Catholic education, and yet not only have no interest in the so-called traditional Latin Mass movement, protest, whatever you want to call it, but even oppose it, because I do oppose it. How can this be true, that one work to promote classical Catholic education and yet oppose all of this complaining and talk about fighting for the Latin Mass in the Catholic Church? And like I said, for me, this is a very easy question to answer, because these two things have nothing to do with each other, and I can very clearly demonstrate this and explain what the real situation is. First of all, anytime we get into a discussion like this, we have to define terms, and these folks don't like to define terms. They like to keep things ambiguous so they can constantly slip out of situations where they're cornered with their false arguments, and they have to keep themselves always capable of escaping, and they do this by never defining any terms. This is why they love to fire away quotes from all different sources. They don't establish the context or prove the interpretation or intent of any of those quotes. They just rapid fire information and pretend that by throwing handfuls of rocks, they're actually proving something. This is just sophistry. This isn't persuasive reasoning. This isn't truth-seeking. It's just taking one's opinion and trying to make it appear reasonable when there's actually no reason to support it. So let's define some terms before we get started, and this will be very clear. First of all, we can call ourselves traditional Catholics and use this label that we assign to ourselves. We can self-identify as anything we want. I can self-identify as an alien. That doesn't mean I actually am an alien. And in the same way, we can self-identify as so-called traditional Catholics and present this image or present this idea that we are those who are interested in preserving and continuing a certain kind of life or culture that was done before. We can pretend we're doing this. We can pretend that we are the preservers of something that was past and call ourselves traditional. But whether we actually are doing that or not, or actually are just making up our own way and pretending that someone did it in the past, is actually true. But we can claim whatever we want. As I said, I can identify myself as a blue elephant. It doesn't mean I actually am an elephant or that I'm blue. I can label myself in any way I please. And so when we talk about traditional Catholics, this self-labeling idea, we have to ask, what are they actually talking about? And whether or not anyone in church history, any saint or doctor of the church actually thought or acted the way they do. And I would argue that no, that's not true. That there's nothing true about the so-called traditional Catholic movement. The essence of what it means to be Catholic is actually not true in their thinking. They may attach themselves to certain accidentals of the Catholic life, like a particular liturgy or rite, but the substance of Catholicism they actually abandon, and therefore their self-labeling as tradition is simply misusing a term. It's sophistry. So that's the first problem. If I was going to say, what is a traditional Catholic? I would say a traditional Catholic is one who maintains the essence or the substance of Catholicism. And that would be to believe in the teaching of the Catholic Church and be obedient to the hierarchy of the Church. That's what it means to be a Catholic. And we can see that this traditional Catholic crowd that prides itself on contradicting popes and bishops and threatening to disobey the judgment of popes and bishops lacks the substance or essence of Catholicism, while they cling to accidents like liturgical details or particular rites from church history. So I believe that self-identifying as traditional is false. It's sophistry. They're identifying by accidents rather than by essentials. So that's the first term, traditional Catholic, that we need to clarify and argue that if you're going to claim to be a traditional Catholic, you need to retain the essence of Catholicism, which is obedience to the Catholic Church. That's issue number one. Secondly, the abbreviation TLM is used. TLM. And what happens through this sophistry, again, is that the initials TLM signify Tridentine Latin Mass. And that means the Latin Mass that was established as the ordinary form of Mass at the Council of Trent in 1570. It's called the Tridentine because the Latin adjective means belonging to Trent, where the Council of Trent took place. It's called the Latin Mass of Trent. That's what Tridentine Latin Mass actually means. The Latin Mass of Trent, or the Tridentine Catholic, or Tridentine Latin Mass. That's what TLM actually stands for. It refers to a particular rite in Catholic Church history, a rite that was established and promoted as the ordinary form of the Mass in 1570 at the Council of Trent. That's why it's called the Tridentine Latin Mass. What happens in this traditional Catholic community, again, through sophistry, is that this abbreviation is changed in its meaning. And it's changed from Tridentine Latin Mass to traditional Latin Mass. They change the meaning of the letters. They change it from Tridentine to traditional. And that's not what TLM actually stands for. TLM used in the Church does not refer to traditional Latin Mass. It refers to Tridentine Latin Mass. they like to change the meaning of the abbreviation to make it appear to have a broader signification than it actually does. They like to pretend that it signifies something that was always in place before and has suddenly been changed in the modern church. And this is, of course, false. As I said, TLM does not stand for traditional Latin Mass or historic Latin Mass or the Mass of the Ages, as they like to say. TLM refers to a specific rite in church history, which was established in 1570. So that's another misuse of terms. First of all, as I said, the traditional Catholic label that they give to themselves as some kind of honorary title that you simply take upon yourself and identify by. I am a traditional Catholic. Well, that's quite a claim. That's quite a claim. I think we would need to prove that first. And the fact that you're contradicting popes and bishops and threatening to disobey if told that you can't continue in your chosen rite, it suggests that you're not a traditional Catholic. You're more like a traditional Protestant, because that's the essence of Protestantism. So we've got these two terms, traditional Catholic and TLM, both of which get misused in these conversations. And we've got to be careful that we keep people accountable to use terms synonymously. That is, every time we use a term, we make sure it signifies the same idea. We're not allowed to change meanings. We're not allowed to say TLM and have that represent Tridentan Latin Mass in some discussions, and then suddenly change the meaning behind the word and start using it for traditional Latin Mass to express a different idea. Can't do that. That's not how reasoning works. So let's, first of all, be careful with the terms that we use. Now, as I said before, the folks who identify themselves as so-called traditional Catholics, I object to that label. I object to their self-identification as such. In their contradiction of popes and bishops, in their threat to disobey or their willingness to disobey the judgment of popes and bishops, which make up together the magisterium of the church, they actually prove themselves not only to not act like any traditional Catholics ever have, but to not even act like Catholics at all. This is the bigger problem. Traditional Catholics weren't people who disobeyed popes and bishops. Traditional Catholics were people who obeyed popes and bishops. The saints were people who obeyed popes and bishops. And no one can be labeled a traditional Catholic other than the saints, if we want to look for examples. The saints did not disobey, contradict, defy, criticize, mock, disrespect the Pope and bishops at any time in church history, ever. If they did so, they likely would have been put in prison or put to death even. Modern Catholics can get away with this stuff because the church doesn't seek to or isn't able to enforce its authority as a political power in the modern world, and therefore it limits itself to exercise its spiritual power. And so suddenly there's, lots of bold talkers willing to talk against popes and bishops now that they know that the church isn't even exercising temporal power any longer, isn't enforcing the rules of the church as secular laws anymore with any kind of corporal punishment. Everyone is bold in the modern age. And the apostles actually warned about the spirit of the age as time went on, that it would become a spirit of disobedience and arrogance and so on. And this is all that we see. People who are bold to speak against superiors because they know that they're physically not in any danger. It's like Georgie Porgy. You know the old nursery rhyme, Georgie porging puddin' pie, kissed the girls and made them cry. But when the boys came out to play, Georgie Porgy ran away. That's the kind of toughness. It's like this picking on the girls' toughness in a local school punk. They know that there's no danger, and so they play bold. But they're not interested in hanging around when any of the boys come out to play. They just bother the girls. And this can be seen in all of their so-called debates, which I recently talked about. When these so-called traditional Catholics want to pretend that they're going to debate someone, they don't arrange a debate with a Dominican theologian or an actual scholastic philosopher in the church. And when I say scholastic, again, I'm talking about Dominicans whose whole lives are devoted to the pursuit of scholastic learning. I'm not talking about some random college professor who, because of his employment, identifies himself as a scholastic philosopher. The self-labeling in these circles just becomes ridiculous. Somebody identifies as something, and then he goes and represents that school of philosophy on his own with no authorization. He goes and represents it in some goofy private debate, can't explain the answers to the questions, and then people imagine that they've somehow overcome the school of philosophy that he's chosen to set himself up as a representative of. And it's just this phony, private debating that these people participate in. I've never seen a representative of this anti-Pope, anti-Second Vatican Council, traditional Latin Mass crowd actually participate in a formal debate with a Dominican theologian. We don't see anything like that. We see these goofy debates between self-labeling representatives of different groups, which doesn't prove anything. It's Georgie Porgy confidence. Now, once we get past all of this self-labeling, like I said, the saints are the only traditional Catholics, and we can look back at the saints and see that they had nothing of this spirit that's in this so-called modern traditional crowd. When Padre Pio was being led by his own inspiration, and he's a saint, so no one living can say, yeah, I'm like Padre Pio. No, it's not for you to decide that you're like Padre Pio. Padre Pio is a canonized saint. His sanctity is recognized by the Church formally through canonization. You can't claim to be like Padre Pio because there's important elements of what it means to be saintly. One of the things that marks a saint is the spirit of obedience and humility. This was actually what set Padre Pio apart and caused the Church to deal with him carefully. While there were all kinds of accusations that Padre Pio was wacky in his generation, all kinds of false accusations of bad behavior, there was one thing that the hierarchy of the Church always noticed about Padre Pio that made them think twice, and it was his humility and obedience. That any time a trouble arose, where there were accusations or allegations of some kind of craziness in Padre Pio's life, the Church would step in. The Church would, for the sake of caution, put restrictions on Padre Pio. And Padre Pio would humbly obey and submit to those restrictions. That was what signaled to the Church that Padre Pio was legitimate, his obedience. Those, therefore, who imagine that because they face some opposition from a bishop or from the hierarchy of the Church in some way, even the Pope himself, who pretend that because they face opposition from the Church, they are like Padre Pio, you see, they're just crazy. Why don't you think maybe you're like Martin Luther, who also faced opposition from the Pope because he was a schismatic and ultimately a heretic? Maybe you should realize that there are different circumstances where men have faced opposition from the hierarchy of the Church. Most of them were schismatics and heretics, and a few of them were actually saints who the Church was working to discern the origin of their inspirations, whether they were actually from heaven or were some kind of delusion or temptation. So just because you're facing opposition from the hierarchy of the Church doesn't mean you're like Padre Pio. Another example would be John Bosco. Saint John Bosco also was surrounded with controversy at times and faced opposition from leaders in the Church because what he was doing was novel in many ways, and the Church wasn't sure about what they should do with it. And there were times where the bishops restricted John Bosco's ministry because it was unusual. And again, what marked John Bosco as a saint was that when his authorities spoke, he obeyed. He was humble and obedient to the hierarchy of the Church in all things. So again, just because the hierarchy opposes someone doesn't mean that that person is like Padre Pio or John Bosco. The mark of saintliness is submission to authority and obedience. So when we see these so-called traditional Catholics fighting back against the bishops and the Pope, and we see, for example, this Father James Altman, who's told to stop preaching as he's preaching by his superior, and he decides that he's going to protest and refuse to stop doing what he's doing. He's not being opposed in a way like Padre Pio. He's not being opposed in a way like St. John Bosco. He's being opposed, as we see revealed by his response to the authority of the Church, he's being opposed as Martin Luther was opposed, as a disobedient, schismatic individual who sets his private judgment up above that of the hierarchy of the Church. Padre Pio didn't do that. John Bosco didn't do that. Martin Luther did that. And so obedience, submission to authority, humility, these things are the marks of saints. And just because someone is being opposed by the hierarchy of the Church does not mean he is therefore like Padre Pio. It's much more likely that he's like Martin Luther, who was not only opposed by the Church, but disobeyed the Church. So this idea that because we're opposed to the judgment of the Church, we are traditional Catholics, it's easily demonstrable that that is not true. They are not like the saints. And you can see that when they are opposed by authority, their idea, their response is that they're going to resist or defy church authority, which the saints never did. And there have been controversial saints. But what marked them as saints was their obedience. So this behavior, like one group of these people held a conference recently where they sort of express this formal defiance of the... This is nothing like any behavior from saints. This is Protestantism. This is Protestantism. The saints did not react in this way. The saints did not react in this way. There were occasions where saints were opposed by local authorities like a bishop, and a saint would appeal to a higher authority for judgment. And then the saint submitted to that judgment. In this matter of the Tridental Latin Mass, we already know the judgment of the highest authorities in the church. This isn't a local dispute where there's just one sourpuss bishop who doesn't like the Latin Mass giving people trouble. We know that the Pope himself has already addressed this issue. And so when we see the people who label themselves as traditional Catholics and in their delusion imagine that they have saints like Padre Pio on their side, we can easily dismiss this as nothing but schismatic and likely heretical future behavior. So they have nothing to do with traditional Catholicism because traditional Catholics, that is the saints, were always submissive to the judgment of the Church. St. Ignatius of Loyola, in his Spiritual Exercises, which is considered to be a Catholic classic, I think it would be considered traditional Catholicism. No, the Spiritual Exercises. In the Spiritual Exercises, in the back, he writes on how we may have right sentiment or right thoughts as Catholics in the Church, and he explains this famous principle that if the Catholic Church, if the hierarchy of the Catholic Church contradicts my private judgment, then that's it. That's it. He says, he uses this illustration from Contraries. He says, if something to me, and I don't know if I get the colors in the right order, but he says, if something to me appears white and the hierarchy of the church declares it to be black, then it is black. He may say the colors in the other direction, but that's not the point. The point is simply, if there is a contradiction between my private judgment and the judgment of the hierarchy of the church, it's over. And he explains that this is necessary to maintain right sentiment in the church. This is in the Spiritual Exercises. And I don't believe that Taylor Marshall or Michael Voris or any of these other online self-identifying traditional Catholics are more truly traditional Catholics than St. Ignatius of Loyola. I may be wrong, but I think I'm pretty safe in assuming that St. Ignatius of Loyola more accurately represents true traditional Catholicism than some guys with YouTube channels criticizing the judgment of popes, cardinals, and bishops, even councils. To have right sentiment in the church, we are always to submit our private judgment to that of the hierarchical church. End of discussion. That's what traditional Catholicism is. And therefore, anyone who contradicts and defies church authority cannot label himself or identify as a quote-unquote traditional Catholic. It's very weird that they try to do this. And secondly, when we talk about the Latin Mass, the Tridental Latin Mass was established at the Council of Trent by the Catholic Church, by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. The same authority that established the Tridentine Catholic or Latin Mass, the same authority that established the Tridentine Latin Mass, also established the Novus Ordo Mass at the Second Vatican Council in 1970. It's the same authority exercising its authority on the celebration of the Mass. No one can claim that the Tridentine Latin Mass is authoritative, but the Novus Ordo Mass is not authoritative. Anyone who says that is simply false. They're either crazy or they are simply mistaken. The same authority that established the so-called TLM, the Tridentine Latin Mass, also established the Novus Ordo Mass and set it as the ordinary form of the Mass for the Catholic Church beginning in 1970. And the Tridentine Latin Mass was set down as what's called the extraordinary form. And extraordinary in this context doesn't mean excellent or better. It means the not ordinary, out of the ordinary form, the unusual form of the Latin Mass. And the Church has given permission to certain people in certain places to celebrate, to continue to celebrate the Tridentine Latin Mass. It's very simple. The Church has not done away with the Tridentine Latin Mass, as these people falsely suggest. The Church has not only approved the continued celebration of the Tridentine Latin Mass, but it has in modern times created an order of priests, a society of priests specifically to preserve and celebrate the Tridentine Latin Mass. This is the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, or FSSP. The Church has established and continues to support the celebration of the Tridentine Latin Mass in approved places by approved priests. So any claim that the Church has banished the quote-unquote Mass of the Ages is just a bunch of irrational, dishonest baloney. What is true, and this is, we can always see people who are not concerned with the truth because they exaggerate and they misrepresent the details. What the Church has actually done is restrict the celebration of the Tridentine Latin Mass to approved persons and places. That's all. And the reason why is because the Church knows that some people who are wacky are attracted to the Latin Mass and they celebrate it as a symbol of defiance against the Second Vatican Council. And when the Church judges that that is actually the motivation of the people showing an interest in the Latin Mass, they shut it down because those people are not rightly disposed to celebrate the Mass at all, let alone the Tridentine Latin Mass. That's what the Church has actually done. Where the Latin Mass is celebrated as a sign of defiance against the Second Vatican Council, it's been shut down. In places where the Tridentine Latin Mass is celebrated in obedience to the Church, with the right disposition, with priests who are approved by bishops, where it's understood that this is not some kind of protest against the hierarchy of the Church or protest against the Second Vatican Council, but this is simply an enjoyment of a traditional rite that's allowed by the Church where Catholics have the right disposition. It continues to be celebrated. That's true here in the Diocese of Charlotte where I live. We have a bishop who's very friendly to traditional Catholicism, real traditional Catholicism, not crazy Protestant religion called traditional Catholicism. We have a brand new college seminary that's been established here in the Diocese of Charlotte, and it's very supportive of the Tridentine Latin Mass. There's no problem in the Church with the Tridentine Latin Mass. The problem in the Church is with groups of people who are misled in their thinking, who are not properly disposed towards the sacraments and towards the hierarchy of the Church, who use the Latin Mass as a sign of defiance against the Second Vatican Council. Those groups are restricted. That's what actually is going on in the Church. And those who identify as traditional Catholics and do this sort of thing manifest their unsaintliness by refusing to submit to the judgment of the Church. They prove that they are actually not like Padre Pio, not like John Bosco, but more like Martin Luther. And so they're willing to even leave approved parishes where approved masses are offered and go and find, I don't want to call them churches or even parishes because they're really not. They'll go and find places where men are offering the so-called Latin Mass without approval from the Church. They're committed more to a rite which is accidental to the Catholic faith. They're more committed to an accident than to the substance of the Catholic faith, which is obedience to the hierarchy of the Church. That's where their error and false disposition and unsaintliness is manifested. And there's nothing else to say. As soon as we see someone willing to defy and contradict the hierarchy of the Church, there's nothing else to say. There's nothing to argue. There's nothing to debate. The essence of the faith is clearly denied. And they can label themselves as anything they want. But their disobedience identifies them as no Catholics at all. If they were Catholics, they might have certain private judgments, but when the hierarchy of the Church contradicted them, they would subject their private judgment to the judgment of the Church and trust. They would trust that having the blessing of the Church on their obedience, they would have everything that they needed to continue to grow spiritually in the imitation of Christ. Because the blessing of God is the means by which we grow spiritually. Not any certain ritual, not any certain words, not any certain mantras or recipes for liturgical life, but the blessing of the Church. That's what matters. A similar controversy developed back in the 1600s when efforts were made to translate the Bible into English. There were two different movements for the translation of the Scriptures into English. One was Catholic, which was carried out by Catholic priests at Douay and Rheims, which is where the Douay-Rheims Bible comes from. And another movement was underway to translate the Bible in England under the authority and patronage of King James. So we have the King James Bible, which was published in 1611, and we had the Douay-Rheims Bible, which was published a year before that in 1610. So we had these two English translations of the Bible that were produced. It was clear to everyone that the King James Version was a far more beautiful translation than the Douay-Rheims Bible. It was very clear that the King James Bible was a better translation than the Douay-Rheims Bible. Everyone knew that, and yet the Douay-Rheims was preferred by Catholics because it was approved. That's what mattered. It didn't matter. We could make all kinds of arguments and say that the King James Bible was more beautifully translated. It was, as St. John Henry Newman said, majestic, and so on. But it didn't matter because it was not the approved Bible version. And so Catholics read the Douay-Rheims Bible, which was known to be inferior because it was the approved translation. Later on, revisions were made to the Douay-Rheims Bible, and you can trace this out on your own. Revisions were made to the Douay-Rheims Bible to make it more like the King James Bible. And so you can look at the original Douay-Rheims Bible and read through that a little bit, get the spirit and sense of the translation, and then go and look at the revised versions. I think it was in the mid-1800s. The Douay-Rheims was revised, and the revisions simply made it more like the King James Bible. Because the King James Bible became a literary classic, and it remains such to this day, one of the greatest works of English literature, the King James Bible. But it's not an approved Catholic translation, and so it has never been a part of English-speaking Catholic culture. It has been rejected by Catholics not because it isn't more beautiful or better, but because it isn't approved. Because the approval of the Church is ultimately essential. Because we seek God's blessing, and God blesses the obedient, not the aesthetic. He doesn't bless those who have the prettier church building and the nicer suit on Sunday and the better translation and the more pleasant music. God has not promised his blessing upon the aesthetically superior people in society. He's promised it to those who obey him, to those who live an orderly life subject to authority that he himself establishes. That's what obedience is. And just as the obedience of reading the Douay-Rheims Bible was better than turning to the unapproved King James Bible, which was aesthetically superior, just as that is an example of good Catholic living, choosing that which is approved rather than that which is disapproved, even though it has aesthetic qualities that recommend it. That's what it means to be an orderly and obedient Catholic, to submit to the judgment of the Church. That was done at the time of the English Bible translations. That is the same dilemma today in this Tridentine Latin Mass controversy. Where the Mass is approved, it can be enjoyed with confidence in the blessing of the Church. That blessing of the Church comes through the unity in the Church. There is no blessing where there is no unity. So if a priest separates himself from the Pope and bishops and organizes his own, whatever he calls it, I don't understand what you would call it. Would you call it a Catholic Church? I don't know that you can call it a Catholic Church. But he sets up his own Mass, and he then goes about acting out the celebration of the Mass. There is no reason to believe that that celebration is bringing about the spiritual things that the priest is pretending it's bringing about, because it's not approved by the church and is being performed without the unity that Christ has commanded in the church. If there's no unity between any group that calls itself Catholic and the Pope, it's separated from the vine, as Christ said. You can go through the motions, you can carry out the rituals, but you have no way to demonstrate or no reason to believe that the graces are going to be administered through those activities when they're separated from the head of the church. Jesus said this in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, if you go to worship God and there's division between you and your brother, leave your gift. In other words, don't offer that worship. Leave that gift. Go and be reconciled to your brother, and then offer your gift. In other words, Christ is not interested in the sacrifices and worship of people who are separated from the unity of the church. You can go through all the motions, you can act like you're having Mass, but if you're acting in defiance to the head of the Catholic Church that Christ established himself, you're just acting. You're just acting. And you have no reason to be confident that the spiritual realities that are hoped for in the Mass are actually taking place when you're separated from Christ's vicar on earth. It's not reasonable to think that that's true. It would be better, I would say personally, I would rather worship God in the ugliest parish on earth if I knew his blessing was upon that celebration than the most luxurious, elaborate ceremony that lacked God's approval. The approval and promise of blessing is what is essential. Not the words of the ritual, not the actions of the ritual, not the vestments of the priest, not the architecture of the building, not the style of music. None of those things are essential. What is essential to the Mass is the presence of Christ. That's the essence. And if there's division and separation from Christ's vicar, what is there? Christ is not present outside of or in a place that defies his vicar. That doesn't even make any sense. And you can tell yourself that, just as the Protestants tell themselves that Christ is present at their Sunday services, but you're denying the Catholic faith. You're denying Christ's appointment of Peter as the rock of his church. No saints ever did this. No traditional Catholics ever did this. It's a delusion. You're being caught up in sophistry and being deceived by aesthetics rather than focusing on the essentials of the Catholic faith. Now, I've talked a lot about this whole traditional Latin Mass thing and why I reject that whole idea. Like I said, I would rather worship God in an ugly parish that I knew was approved, just like I would rather read the Douay-Rheims Bible because it's approved rather than the King James Version, because I study sacred scripture not merely for a knowledge of the words, but for the grace that's promised to those who read the scriptures. But that grace is not promised to those who study translations of the Bible or editions of the Bible that are not approved by the Catholic Church. It's not some kind of Gnostic Protestant religion where I'm just hoping to get the words right. I also seek the graces and the blessings promised to those who do it in the right way, in obedience to the authority of the Church. That's what it means to do it in the right way. So I oppose all of that, what I consider to be nonsense of this phony, self-identifying traditional Catholicism and this disobedient, defiant participation in a certain rite in a set of circumstances where it does not have the approval of the hierarchy of the Church. There's nothing traditional or Catholic about that at all. Unless you're lost in accidental things and no longer thinking about the essential things. So having said all that, when it comes to classical education, because the original question was, how can a person who opposes this whole Tridentan Latin Mass movement, how can a person who opposes that so zealously promote classical Catholic education? And the answer is they have nothing to do with each other. I would argue that traditional Catholic movement is just a counterfeit of real spirituality. It's impatient, it's disobedient, it's arrogant, it's misled, it's focused on accidentals and externals rather than substance. It's a counterfeit of real Catholicism. In the same way, in modern education, we can find a counterfeit classical education movement, and I've talked about this quite a bit. We can find counterfeit classical education, just as we can find counterfeit traditional Catholicism. We can find, and I've demonstrated this in a number of videos and articles, we can find groups of Catholics who have started schools or starting publishing companies and have labeled themselves, again, self-identifying as classical education, claiming to return to what used to be done in the old days. And they're simply liars, because what they're doing is not anything that was done in the old days. They're simply selling products that are different from what's done to a degree, accidentally, superficially different from what's done in the modern schools, while still maintaining the essence of the errors of the modern schools. It's a counterfeit classical education movement, and there have been a number of influential Catholics who have led this. One of them is Laura Berquist, who started Mother of Divine Grace School, and just leads thousands of Catholic families with this false advertising that what they're doing is restoring, quote-unquote, traditional Catholic education. And it's just a fantasy. The education that they restore, the schools that they start, the books they publish, the work that they do has nothing to do with what wise men and saints studied in the past. I am a Catholic classicist. I study the classical liberal arts. I study scholastic philosophy. I'm a lay Dominican. I seek to lead students through the study of real, historic Catholic subjects and courses using real, original source texts, the same texts, perhaps in translation, but the same nevertheless, the same texts that were used 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago. It's the same essential education. The same education St. Augustine had, the same education that Boethius and St. Bernard had, the same education that Thomas Aquinas had, and so on. Of course, it changed in the time of Thomas Aquinas because Aristotelian philosophy was established and rightly explained. So a lot of the Platonist influence was removed, and a lot of the trouble caused by it was also removed through scholastic philosophy. But I teach real scholastic philosophy and the real classical liberal arts to modern students. What does that have to do with a counterfeit Latin Mass movement? It's got nothing to do with it. I'm interested in the real essence of things. I'm not interested in accidentals. I'm not interested in superficial activity. I don't judge books by their cover. I'm not concerned about the incense and the stained glass windows and the vestments of the priest. I'm interested in whether Christ is present in a celebration or not. That's what I'm interested in. And in education, I'm not interested in whether I have pictures of saints on my books. I'm not interested if I use the same words, albeit with different definitions, as the fake classical education movement does. But I'm interested in the essence of historic Catholic education, the same education that was pursued by the saints, which they write about, which they teach about. This isn't a mystery. I'm interested in real historic Catholic education, real philosophical, theological education, classical liberal arts education. That's what I'm interested in. The real thing from real, authentic, master sources. What does that have to do with the Tridentan Latin Mass protests? It has nothing to do with that. It's exactly the opposite. As I said, it's a mission that pursues the restoration of essentials. It's not a fight over accidentals. Now, another difference is I can look at the modern public schools and I can look at modern Catholic schools, and I have no problem with those schools because they serve a different mission. They serve a different mission than classical Catholic education ever served. Modern public schools and modern Catholic schools serve a need that did not exist 200 years ago. The need that modern schools serve is the fulfillment of the requirements of modern compulsory education. Modern compulsory education places requirements on all school-aged children. This never existed in history. These legal requirements demand that all school-aged children receive a basic education. This is a legal obligation. This never existed in history, and modern public schools and modern Catholic schools exist to fulfill this legal obligation. The public schools do it directly. The Catholic schools seek to offer a Catholic alternative to the public schools. The Catholic schools are not organized or managed to provide all of the children in a parish with a scholastic philosophical education. They're not there to teach all of the children in the parish classical Latin and Greek, nor were parish children in history ever given such an education. The parish school is intended to fulfill the compulsory education requirements for Catholic children and anyone else who would like to attend. And I have no problem with modern Catholic schools because they serve a different mission than classical Catholic education. Throughout history, very few Catholics ever received a classical Catholic education. Very few. In medieval society, if you didn't receive a classical Catholic education, you either were sent to apprentice for a trade or you were sent out into the field to work. There was no common school. There was no public school. There was no parochial school system because there was no compulsory education, largely because the society was not democratic. So I have no problem with the modern schools. There's no conflict between what I do in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, promoting classical Catholic education, and what the local Catholic parish school does in fulfilling the obligations of compulsory education laws. Two completely separate missions that can work side by side with no conflict. If there was going to be any conflict, it would be modern schools complaining about what I'm doing. I don't complain about what they're doing. In fact, I just published a talk 2 days ago where I explained that the reason why educational standards in modern schools are low is not because of modern schools, it's because of parents. So I am not in a battle with the modern church. I am not in a battle with the modern Catholic school. I'm serving a completely different mission because the mission of the Catholic school didn't even exist in Catholic church history. I'm seeking to restore the classical Catholic education that was available throughout Catholic history and was only available to a small number of students. That's my life's work. Before I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, before I started the academy, the first thing that I did was I wrote a letter to my bishop, explained my intentions, and asked for his permission to establish the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I sought the permission of my superior in the church. I asked for permission from the bishop. The bishop arranged a number of meetings for me and his vicar of education, and I met at the diocesan office with the vicar of education a couple of times to talk about all of my plans, what I wanted to offer, what I was hoping to restore, what my intentions were, and so on. And I explained that I wanted to do it with, not any kind of formal authorization. I didn't want some kind of advertising material. I was just looking personally for permission to pursue this so that I would know that I wasn't doing anything that was not approved of in the church. Not only was I given permission to establish the Classical Liberal Arts Academy as a private online program and tutoring service, but I was also given permission to go ahead and pursue the foundation of an independent Catholic school if I wanted to. I chose not to do that, but I was encouraged to go ahead and do that. That wasn't my intention, but I was approved in my mission to restore the classical liberal arts and teach them, proving that there's no contradiction, there's no conflict between what I do in teaching the classical liberal arts, in restoring real classical Catholic education for students who want it, and what the Catholic schools do in offering a modern educational program for all children that satisfies the obligations of compulsory education. So what I do has absolutely nothing to do with this so-called traditional Catholic protest. It has nothing to do with it. It's of a completely different spirit. It's not concerned with shallow external things. It's carried out with the approval of the church. It actually preserves what saints did and recommended and taught. It doesn't act contrary to the example of the saints like this Latin Mass protest movement does. And so when we ask the question, how can a person who is so focused in restoring pure classical Catholic education, how is he opposed to the traditional Catholic movement? The answer is simply, I'm not interested in some fake Protestantish superficial activity that operates without the approval or blessing of the Catholic Church. That's why I have absolutely no interest in the traditional Latin Mass movement. If it's approved by the Church, if it's being enjoyed in a place that's approved by priests who are approved by their bishops in union with the Pope, awesome. That's great. The Church provides for that. But the minute that that's not the case, the minute that we move from an approved Mass to a disapproved Mass, garbage. I don't want to hear it. It's Protestantism. Many Catholics, like I said, would object to the study of the King James Bible for this exact reason. It's not approved. And that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if you agree with it. It doesn't matter if I agree with it. I, for example, am a lover of the King James Bible. I was an Anglican convert to Catholicism. I love the King James Bible. I still have the King James Bible memorized. And I had to discipline myself to say that although I love the King James Bible, it was not an approved translation, and I had to give it up. And I set it aside, and I turned to the Douay-Rheims Bible, which I don't believe is as pleasing an English translation as the King James Bible, but nevertheless, I'm happy to study the Douay-Rheims Bible because I know that it's approved. And if you don't have that sense within you that it's better for you to do what's approved than to do something that you like which is not approved, then I think that that's a deeper problem. I think that's the issue. I don't think that that's a Catholic spirit. I would rather, like I said, go with what I judge to be an inferior translation or even an inferior parish, knowing that it's approved, than to have something that I judge to be more pleasant, which is not approved. That's just a non-negotiable for me as a Catholic. And the same discipline that I use to order my Catholic life and refuse to ever disobey the hierarchy of the Church, it's the same discipline that makes me not interested in counterfeit classical education movements, counterfeit Latin Mass movements, counterfeit Protestantism, counterfeit educational movements. I want the real thing. I want real Catholicism with God's blessing. I want real wisdom in the guidance and direction of the saints and wise men of history. That's why I can be laser focused and radically uncompromising in classical Catholic education and at the same time have absolutely no interest in any protest against the hierarchy of the Church for some liturgical rite. It's very simple. I hope that makes things clear. God bless.